We've had so many different speakers from different Sunday school classes, and it's just been a treasure to get to hear the different ones. And so many wonderful things that are brought out in these Sunday school classes, and we appreciate each and every one. This book of Hebrews is somewhat different in its perspective than a lot of the books of the New Testament. It's a very important book, and we've enjoyed studying it so far. We understand that we don't know the author of this particular book. And just know that it's the Holy Spirit, because this book is so important to try to confirm to us what it is we believe, and also to the Jews who were struggling with giving up their ceremonial laws that they had been practiced for generations and centuries. And so this book is, we call it a letter, was written to them specifically because they were struggling so much. The ones who were believers in Jesus Christ were struggling with what they were having to give up, as far as the confidence to give up the priesthood and to give up their synagogues, because they were shunned. They would have been shunned out of their synagogues so that they were not allowed to come in anymore and commune that way with the people. And then those who were wanting to come to Christ but could never just take that next step to believe. And so this writer is trying to very well go back into the Old Testament and convince them of what it is that is Jesus Christ and how it was promised of God long ago, and help them to see. And also to help them understand who Jesus is. And we know that in chapter 1, we studied about how Jesus is better than the angels, that he was not an angel, that he had better than the angels. He was more than the angels. And in chapter 2, chapter 1 was about how he was better than the prophets, and chapter 2 was how he was better than the angels, that he was exalted, more preeminent than the angels and the prophets. Chapter 3, we studied about how he was a better one than Moses. In chapter 4, we studied about how it was a better rest, how the peace that you have, the restoration of human beings to God was better in Jesus Christ, because it was personal, whereas with the priesthood it was not. And then beginning in chapter 5, we started studying about how Jesus was a better priest, out of a different order than the priesthood that was established during the time of Moses. And so that's kind of where we've got to. And when we left off last week, the writer was encouraging the Jews to follow the Christians that were there in their midst. Be like them. See how they love the people. See how the joy of their spirit, the freedom of their spirit to love and help their neighbors. So be like the Christians. And then today we're going to look further how he's telling them to be like Abraham. And so we're going to be going back into the Old Testament a little bit more today, because that's what this writer did. He took them back, and they knew their scriptures, and he took them back in their scriptures to show them how Abraham received a promise. And so the writer is sort of saying, who can you trust? You know, you might not think you can trust what these new Christians are showing to you. And you might not feel like you can fully trust it. Who can you trust in telling you the truth? Who can you trust when they make a promise that they're going to keep it? So let's look at Abraham. Who did he trust? He believed God and he trusted God. Did God keep his promise to Abraham? You can trust that. If Abraham believed in God, and it was a God that kept his promise, and they're at the position where they could look back. I mean, even in their day, 2,000 years ago, they could look back at the time of Abraham and say, well, yeah, God did keep his promise to Abraham. What did God promise Abraham? He promised him seed that would multiply to be like the stars. There would be so many of them. And he also promised them a land where their people could live. And of course, they had trouble wanting to believe enough to go in and take that land at times. But he gave them a land. And they could look back and see that history and know, yes, God kept that promise. So we're going to start there in verse 13 of chapter 6 of Hebrews. And I want you to think about, as we read this, about the promise it talks about here. What was the promise? Did God keep the promise? And is what God promised Abraham linking to what the promise is today? And can you believe God when he tells you that he has done something and that he's going to do something and he's going to keep to his promise? For when God made promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself. Now, that verse right there is pretty intriguing, isn't it? What does that mean? It means the writer's telling and reminding his readers and hearers that there is not one any greater than God. And in that day, when you want to say something and give your word, and your word is important, you say you're going to do something, you're going to keep to your word, and you might swear by one greater than you. Like we might say, in God's name, I promise you I am going to do what I said I'm going to do. And that was a common thing that people did. They swore by one that was higher than them. And this was a serious promise that they would make, and you were going to keep your word when you did that. Well, who is God going to swear to that's higher than God? And the writer said there is none that's higher than God. So he's going to swear to himself, and he's going to keep that promise. God is not a God who can lie. God is the creator of truth. God is the creator of honesty. And this is a God who gives a promise, is going to keep it. And so he's trying to help these people say that in Abraham's day, God swore to Abraham that he would keep his promise, so you can believe. I want to go back to there just a minute, back to Genesis, and talk a little bit about this time that when God establishes his covenant with Abraham. And we know that Abraham believed, and it was counted to him for righteousness. His belief was counted for righteousness. And so in chapter 15, verse 6, and he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. And we know that Abraham believed, but he's like us. He's not 100% sure he can count on it. I mean, we lift up our prayers, hoping and believing and knowing that God is a God who can and will, as he will, do. But how can we know that we know for sure? And so look at this next verse, 8, and he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? I mean, how am I going to know that you're going to keep your promise? And so Abraham's like we are, and like these people that the writer of Hebrews is writing to. They're people who want to believe, and they have faith in this God, but they just have the human struggle that the flesh is still in a domain of earth. And so he had a struggle with it. And so in those verses, God did an interesting thing. I mean, God is going to show Abraham by a custom that they had in that day. He tells Abraham to go round up these animals, get a sheep, a goat, some birds, doves, I think. And he told for the larger animals to cut them in half, just split them in half and lay them open. And they had a custom in that day that when they would swear an oath the two people that were swearing an oath together would walk through the middle of that blood, and that would count as a surety, a promise that that oath was going to be kept. And so God has Abraham to go get all this stuff together, and he cuts the larger things in half, but he doesn't cut the birds in half because they're so little. But he lays it all out there, and he sits and waits on God to do whatever God's going to do after he rounds his stuff up. And he's even out there shooing the flies and stuff away from it, I think he said at one point there in the verses. And God is going to make a covenant with Abraham, a promise, and he's going to show Abraham that he means business in this promise, and it's a promise that's going to be kept. And so he put, if it's a promise between him and Abraham, you'd think that Abraham would walk through that carcass and that blood with God. But God puts Abraham to sleep. Now that's interesting, isn't it? He puts Abraham to sleep, and Abraham's not even able to walk through and keep the covenant with him, because God is making the covenant with himself. I, God, promise to keep my word, and I swear on my own behalf that I will keep it. And so he walks through this carcass that Abraham has left there for him, and a promise that he's going to keep this. Now, the reason the writer has these hearers to go back into this and hear this is because they are not sure that they can trust this God. And he wants to show them he's a God that can be counted of. God made that promise to Abraham. He swore it to himself, and he's reminding them right here in this verse is that God will swear to himself, because there's no greater one than him that he can swear to. And in verse 14 of Hebrews, saying, surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. And he's telling them, don't you see that we have a God who keeps his promises? For men verily swear by the greater. You swear by one that's greater than you. And an oath for confirmation is to them an end to all strife. It takes away the worry if you're going to keep your promise. Nowadays, we probably expect some kind of a signed lawyer-like document to make people keep their promises. But I think we still live in a community where if somebody says they're going to do something, they do it, and they keep their word as best they can if something, catastrophic doesn't get in there. Wherein, verse 17, God willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath. Confirming that God is not a God of change in the sense that his moral law and the promises he's made. Now, this is getting to a point. We may not see how what happened to Abraham has anything to do with Jesus Christ at that point, but what this writer is trying to say, look, you've got a God that makes promises that he keeps, and he doesn't change. Now, he may have a plan that unfolds gradually over many thousands of years. We don't understand why he didn't just send Jesus to Abraham right then and let Jesus be the priest. We don't know why he didn't send Jesus as the priest during Moses' day and let Jesus be the priest eternal then. He's always been the priest, but he hasn't been present in the people's lives. And another thing that we know is that the whole point of God's plan is to restore man's ability to be present with God. And in their day, after the fall, you remember when Adam started out, he was present with the Lord. He communed with the Lord. The communion was easy. He was at peace with the Lord. And then the fall came and sin came in. And peace was lost between man and God. And man's ability to come before the presence of God was lost. And so the whole idea of a priesthood was to restore communion between man and God. But in that day, they had to go through a different process. And so the writer's coming up to all of that, but he's trying to show them that this is a God who is not going to change. He has made a plan and a commitment. Follow Abraham. Be like Abraham who believed. And he goes on to say that in verse 18, that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul. I mean, that's just a beautiful phrase right there. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil, whither the forerunner is for us entered, even Jesus, made a high priest forever and ever after the order of Melchizedek. Now remember last chapter where the writer said, there is much to talk to you about this priest, Melchizedek, but you can't get it. You don't understand it. You don't even understand your Old Testament scriptures. How can I talk to you about Jesus and the order of Melchizedek? And remember last few chapters we've talked about how the Old Testament was the shadow of the pictures of things to come. I could hold up a picture of a ball, but that's not a ball. You can't bounce it, throw it through a hoop. I guess you could wad it up and do all that, but it's not the fullness of a ball. It's just a picture of a ball. And to actually experience the fullness of what a ball is, you actually have to have the real thing. And that's what Jesus Christ is the fullness of the priesthood. And so the writer was trying to tell them before we read in the verses we read in the last chapters that I can't talk to you about that because you don't even understand your Old Testament scriptures, that God has a plan, and he didn't just have one picture or one type for you to look at. You weren't seeing the fullness of it. And so he's trying to tell him here in these last two verses of chapter 6, we have an hope. And it is an anchor. You know what an anchor is? It holds things in place. And they couldn't go behind that veil in the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was. And they couldn't go in there and grab hold of that Ark of the Covenant because they would have been killed instantly. You couldn't touch it. But he says, we have an oath, an anchor of the soul, sure and steadfast, which can enter into the veil. And we've talked about this every time when we mention the veil. When Jesus Christ was crucified, the veil was torn from top to bottom. And remember, nobody could go into that, behind that Holy of Holies in that veil except for the priest who had cleansed himself. And he could go in there just very quickly, offer up the sacrifice, and come right back out. He could not go in and stay. He couldn't go in and sit down. And the writer is saying, you have a hope. You can actually enter the Holy of Holies. You can grab hold of that, be anchored to that ark. He's not going to turn loose. He's sure and he's holding fast to you. You can enter. He is the high priest forever. And this is an important point that he's trying to bring to the people. And it's our hope, too, to show that this writer took them back to the Old Testament to show them what a sure thing God is. Now we move on in chapter 7, where we're going to talk about the priesthood. And the writer is going to help them see, and we'll be covering this over the next 2 or 3 chapters, about how, yes, the priesthood was established during the time of Moses, but it was not a perfect priesthood. And when we say that, it meant that it had its limitations. It was limited as a figure or an image or a picture or a shadow of the perfect priesthood that was to come. It fulfilled that need of the people to be able to commune with God. The only way they could commune with God was to come into the priest, and the priest would offer sacrifices for their sins. And that was the only communion that they knew that they had with God. And that was the restoration for them at that time. But the writer is going to show them, they thought, those Jews felt like this priesthood that they had that began in Moses' time, was established in Moses' time, was only brought through the tribe of Levi. You know, there were 12 tribes, and sometimes then it's called the Levitical priesthood, because that tribe was set aside, and their main function was to be the priest and to carry out the duties of the priest in the temple. That they didn't go out and do. That was what they were supposed to do. And all tithes that came into the church helped take care of that tribe of people. And because Aaron was the first of the priests, that was Moses' brother Aaron, the first of the priests to be established as the priest of Israel, it's called sometimes the Aaronic priesthood. So those two terms are used to refer to that time. But throughout Psalms and part of the Old Testament, God would tell the people, I'm going to send a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so this writer is helping the people, these Jewish people, see that if there was another priesthood other than the Aaronic priesthood, then yours was not the only one and the only plan that God had. And if God wanted to send another one, God would send another one, and this one in the form of Jesus Christ. So he's trying to get them to reason in their minds that there was another priesthood, and that it was a bit more perfect than their own priesthood. It was different, and it was not from the tribe of Levi. So don't think just because Jesus came out of the tribe of Judah that he can't be a priest, because in the past God had a priesthood of Melchizedek, and he wasn't of the tribe of Levi. Nobody knows what tribe he came from or where he came from, because his genealogy was lost. And so what we'll see, I'm trying to lay the background in this because as we read through it'll make more sense, but in the Aaronic priesthood, you could only be a priest if you were from that tribe. So it was from your genealogy, and you had to know your genealogy, and guarantee you they knew their genealogy all the way back to Adam. And they had to know their genealogy, and so they would be appointed priests, not by oath of God, but by their genealogy. Now, that's not a perfect priesthood, because they got some bad priests that way. You read that Old Testament scriptures, and there were some evil ones. They did not do the will of God, and the people suffered under them. There were some good ones too, we know that. But anyway, it was not a perfect priesthood. This writer wanted them to see that it was not an eternal priesthood. They had to keep replacing the priest. One would die, and his son would take his place. That son would age out and die. The next son would take his place, or, somebody in that tribe. They would take, so they're always having to replace the priest. And Melchizedek, nobody knows, we know he didn't live forever, but after the order of that type of priest where nobody knew when he was born and nobody knows when he died. It was sort of like almost as if it were eternal. Well, God said he was going to send one that would be eternal. It would be a lasting, full priesthood. And so let's get into those verses a little bit in chapter 7. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. Now we know that these Jews think Abraham is the top premier person in their history of belief. I mean, he's just everything to them, below God, but still preeminent in their lives. And so this writer is going to show them that there was this priest who was also a king. Now, in Moses' time, the priest never held the position of king or leader that way. They were the leader of the temple, but they never held that position as king. It was not a kingship. And so he was a priest of the Most High God. There was no other priest above him except God, and he was appointed of God to be the priest of the people in that day. Now, Abraham had been out, he had had battles with these kings around him, and he had won and had victory over them. And when he came in, when he had finished the battles, he appeared before this king, or somehow he met up with this king priest, Melchizedek. And when he did, Abraham paid tithes to him. Now, see, this was another thing. Now, the reason we don't understand this so well is that all of this is hierarchy. Who's above who? Who was premier? Well, we had God in their minds. They had Abraham. They had the king. They had the priest, all above the common man. And the lower one gave way to the one above them and served them. And the writer is trying to show them, look, Abraham, who you think of as your premier person over the priesthood, actually paid tithes to the priest. So in your hierarchy where you think, Abraham is above the priest, well, here Abraham was below the priest. In God's, plan, the way things were then. So God has a plan that may be different there in that covenant than it is now in this covenant. So it says in verse 2, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all. Now, Abraham was not required to give this tithe, but he did, because he glorified this king as one of God. First being, by interpretation, king of righteousness. Now, this was one of the things that the writer in the last chapter said, we had trouble with you understanding Melchizedek, and I couldn't talk to you about him because you don't even understand righteousness and where righteousness comes from and how righteousness is achieved. And so this was a king of righteousness, and we know those priests that served them in the Aaronic covenant were not, the Aaronic priesthood were not righteous. But they had to completely cleanse themselves before they went into the temple. And that also, he was the king of Salem, which is king of peace. So it was a peaceful time. This king was a king over a peaceful kingdom. He was a righteous king. And God told David in Psalms that he was going to send one after the order of Melchizedek, one that fulfilled these kinds of ideals. Melchizedek, in verse 3, was one without father, without mother. Well, now we know he was an earthly man because I think it was in chapter 5, verse 1, it said that he was of man. We know that he was a typical human being on earth. He did have a mother or father, but what the writer is saying is because his genealogy is lost, we don't know who his mother and father were. And so he's not of the Aaronic priesthood. You got to understand, yours is not the only priesthood that's ever been. God chooses what he will establish. And so he's trying to convince them that yours was not the only one in the day of Moses, and you've continued in that priesthood all these generations. It's hard to give up, I know, but it wasn't the only one, and there were others. He had neither beginning of days nor end of life. We don't know when he was born. We don't have that genealogy. We don't know when he died. So the writer's telling the Jews, when God told you in your scriptures, and he said, you need to go back and read your scriptures. Go back and read Psalms, where God promised to send one after the order of Melchizedek. And your priests from the Aaronic priesthood do have a beginning of life. Their birth date is known. Their death date is known, and they are dying. But your Messiah that I'm going to send to you won't have a beginning and won't have an end. He will be eternal. And that's the point he's trying to make here. But made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Now, some people might say, well, maybe Melchizedek was God or was the Son of God. No, it says it was made like him There's a big difference. It didn't say he is the Son of God. It didn't say he is God. It says he's just made like unto the Son of God, in that he served as in a priesthood. So now the writer will go on and lay out all of these in these next verses that we've just talked about. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. And verily they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. And what he's trying to say here is that even your priests, who were born in the time of Moses and then on and on and on until Jesus' day, they were in the loins of Abraham in that they were his seed. And in that sense, they were paying tithes to Melchizedek. So they regarded their priest as one of the highest, most preeminent beings in their lives. And he's saying, look, even they, back in the day of Abraham, as his seed, were paying tithes to one higher than them. And so that's an important point he's making to them. In verse 6 in chapter 7, but he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham and blessed him that had the promise. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. And here men that die receive tithes. But there he received them of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. In other words, it was a priesthood that didn't die. But yours, he's saying, does die out. And as I may also say, Levi also, who receiveth tithes, paid tithes in Abraham, for he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Now this is difficult stuff. I'm going to say I'm not sure I'm doing a good job explaining it. But I'm telling you that he is trying, the writer is really teaching or preaching to the Jews. And it's assurance to us that we have a God who keeps his promises, because he kept his promises to Abraham. We'll go on here. So he's saying in verse 11, now if perfection were made in the priesthood during the times of the Aaronic priest, then there wouldn't have been need for another one, would there? If that was perfect. If God made the restoration of man to himself through the Aaronic priesthood, we wouldn't have needed another one, would we? But it wasn't perfect. It was not a perfect priesthood. If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? I mean, what need was there for another one if it was perfect? And I was sitting there going, well, no, it wasn't a perfect priesthood. Not that it restored the people completely, because they had to keep making a sacrifice every time they sinned. They had to go into the priest and bring that sacrifice, the blood be shed, atonement made every time they sinned. They had to do that. And so it was not perfect. For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. The Melchizedek priesthood didn't require that ceremonial practice. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning a priesthood, and it is yet far more evident, for that after the similitude of Melchizedek there ariseth another priest. And he's going through this, what we just talked about, how Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, and it was not necessary for their tribes were not of Judah, they were of Levi, and yet theirs was not a perfect priesthood. Melchizedek was not of the tribe of Levi. We don't know what tribe he was from. Who is made not after the law of a carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life. For he testifieth, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And this is in Psalms 110:4, if you want to see where that was told to David. For there is verily a disannulling of the commandment going before for the weakness and unprofitableness thereof. For the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did, by which we draw nigh on God. So this is a good place for us to stop, because the priesthood was not a perfect priesthood under the Aaronic covenant, and the Moses covenant, but Melchizedek was a more perfect priesthood, and then Jesus is the perfect priesthood. And we'll stop there. That was poorly explained, I know, but we'll pick up there next week. Thank y'all for listening. So I almost feel like I'm going to